I heard her voice before I saw the lights. I was in my jacuzzi. Back patio. Sunday afternoon water at 102 degrees, a glass of iced tea sweating on the ledge beside me. The kind of quiet you earn. My yard, my fence, my gate with the black iron numbers bolted to the post 14 Crestview Lane. Then from the other side of that fence...
Yes, there's a man in the jacuzzi at 14 Crestview Lane. I don't know who he is. He doesn't belong here.
She was on the phone. She hadn't knocked, hadn't asked. She'd looked over my fence, made up her mind, and dialed 911. 2 patrol officers were at my gate in under 6 minutes. I heard boots on gravel, then a voice.
Sir, we received a call about a possible trespasser at this property. Can you step out of the water for us, please?
I stepped out, wet, barefoot, holding nothing but a towel. The thought that crossed my mind standing there on my own concrete, she picked the wrong man to call cops on. She just didn't know it yet. Karen Whitfield was standing behind the officer's, arms folded, chin elevated, weight back on her heels. The posture of someone who has done this before and watched it work. She wasn't looking at me the way you look at a person you're uncertain about. She was looking at me the way you look at a problem you've already solved. She said it to the officer, not to me, to the officer. See no key fob, no resident ID on him. These people just wander in. These people. I stood on my own property dripping while 2 uniformed officers waited for me to account for myself. The nearer officer, young professional, clearly not interested in being here, asked me to confirm my name and my legal connection to the property. Before I could answer, Karen reached into her jacket and produced a laminated card, navy and gold border, HOA Community Standards Crestview Lane Subdivision. She held it toward the officer with the practiced confidence of someone presenting a credential. This address, she said, is under active HOA compliance review. No one accesses the amenity areas without current board authorization. She said amenity areas, like my backyard was a community pool, like my gate was a turnstile she managed. Then she delivered the line, smooth, rehearsed, no hesitation, the line that would come back to her later in a way she was not going to enjoy. If he actually lived here, he'd know the rules. Nobody who genuinely owns in this community sits in that jacuzzi without checking in with the board first. She glanced at me when she said owns, a half-second edit, a small confident cruelty. I looked past her at the gate. The iron numbers 14 Crestview Lane, my gate, my address, my number on my post. I looked back at the officer. I own this property, I said, even, no volume. Karen laughed a brief controlled exhale and turned back to the officer. With respect, that's exactly what someone in this situation would say. The officer's expression shifted slightly. Not toward Karen. He looked at me again, measuring something different now. I didn't reach for anything. I didn't raise my voice. I said, I'd like both of your badge numbers, please, and I'd like the specific statute she's citing as the legal basis for my removal from this property. Silence. Not long, maybe 4 seconds, but 4 seconds of silence in a confrontation like that is its own kind of statement. The officer's partner looked at Karen. Karen looked at the officer. The laminated card was still in her hand. It wasn't doing the work she needed it to do. Her chin came down just a degree. I noticed. Here is what Karen Whitfield did not know: that Sunday afternoon, standing at the gate of a property she had decided without asking a single question did not belong to me. I had owned this house for 3 years, paid cash. No mortgage, no lien, no co-owner. I had sat in this jacuzzi on Sunday afternoons since the month I moved in. I had never missed a property tax payment. I had never been to a single HOA meeting because I had never been given a single reason to believe it would be worth my time. And I had been up until this exact moment correct about that. She had never checked the county record. She had never needed to. In 11 years of running this neighborhood like a private fiefdom, no one had ever made her. She had looked at me and made a decision. The only variable she hadn't accounted for was the one sitting in a folder in my home office 30 feet from where we were standing. She had no idea the man she'd just had pulled out of a warm jacuzzi on a Sunday afternoon was the only name on the deed for every inch of ground she was standing on. I bought 14 Crestview Lane 3 years before that Sunday afternoon. Cash purchase. Clean title. No mortgage, no co-signer, no lender with opinions about my decisions. I moved in on a Thursday in October with a rented truck and no help, which suited me fine. I'm not the type who needs an audience for a move. The HOA existed the way weather exists. Something you're aware of, something you factor in, something you assume will be manageable. I'd read the CC and Rs before closing. Standard suburban boilerplate: maintain your lawn, don't park commercial vehicles overnight, keep exterior paint within approved pallets. Nothing that troubled me. I signed the acknowledgement form, filed my copy, and thought nothing more about it. I learned I'd been wrong about manageable within my first 7 days. A fine notice appeared under my front door. $150. The citation line read, "Unapproved exterior wind chime installation, Section 12 Aesthetic Standards." There was no wind chime. I had not installed a wind chime. I had not purchased a wind chime. I didn't own anything that could reasonably be described as a wind chime. I set the notice on my kitchen counter and looked at it for a moment. Then I filed it not in the trash, in a folder. That was my first data point on Karen Whitfield. She had been board president for 11 years. That's what people told me when I eventually asked in the careful, quiet way that people in this neighborhood answered questions about Karen like they were checking over their shoulder before they answered. 11 years. 3 board members who rotated in and out, but Karen was the constant, the load-bearing wall. Her system was not complicated. It didn't need to be. She sent notices. If you ignored the notice, a fine arrived. If you ignored the fine, a lien threat arrived. If you ignored the lien threat, the word foreclosure entered the conversation, not in writing, just spoken casually in a tone designed to make your stomach drop and your resolve collapse. Nobody fought her because nobody could afford to. Not really. An HOA dispute attorney costs money that most people in a suburban neighborhood are not eager to spend on what looks from the outside like an argument about paint colors. Karen understood that math better than anyone. She had built her entire operation on it. She had never lost. In 11 years, not once. I heard about Margaret from 2 different neighbors before I ever met her. Margaret Elkins, 72 years old, lived 4 houses down on the same side of the street. Her husband had died in February. That April, 8 weeks after the funeral, she hung a Memorial Day flag on her porch. It wasn't even Memorial Day yet. She'd bought it early because she wanted something to do with her hands. The fine notice arrived 6 days later, $400. Citation, exterior flag display in non-standard color pattern, Section 9 Visual Standards. There had been no board vote authorizing that fine. When Margaret asked to see the meeting minutes where the vote was recorded, Karen told her the records were under administrative review. Margaret paid the $400 because she was 72 years old and her husband was 2 months in the ground and she didn't have the energy to fight a woman with a binder. She told me all of this at her kitchen table with her hands folded around a coffee cup, her voice the particular flat of someone who has finished being surprised by cruelty and has simply filed it away somewhere they don't visit often. I listened. I didn't say much. I drank the coffee and I remembered everything she said. The Garcia family lived on the cross street 1 block over, visible from my back patio on clear days. Eduardo and Rosa. Their son Marco had turned 16 that July and they'd thrown him a birthday party. Relatives, friends, a folding table in the driveway. Marco's cousins parked on the street because the driveway was full. Karen knocked on their door before the cake was served. The lien threat arrived the following Tuesday. The citation referenced a single paragraph from the HOA vehicle policy, repeated overnight street parking by resident vehicles. Marco's cousins had been there for 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon. Eduardo had asked to see the HOA complaint procedure, specifically the clause allowing a 30-day dispute window before any lien action. Karen told him the dispute window had already been waived by the board. She didn't explain how. She didn't need to explain how. She just said it, and Eduardo looked at the notice in his hand and calculated what fighting it would cost versus what paying it would cost, and he paid it. I learned about this 3 weeks later from Rosa in the parking lot of the grocery store 2 miles from the neighborhood. Karen left me alone for the first 2 years. I've thought about why. I think she didn't know what to make of me. I paid cash, which she probably couldn't find out for certain, but likely inferred. I renovated quietly. I declined every HOA meeting invitation by the cleanest possible method. I simply didn't respond. I wasn't hostile. I wasn't present. I was a closed door she hadn't decided to open yet. Then I installed the jacuzzi. It wasn't a violation of anything in the registered CC&Rs I'd checked before the crew arrived. Ground-level concrete pad, rear lot, fully within my property lines, screened from the street. But it was visible from the alley Karen walked every Sunday morning, and Karen had not approved it. Nobody had asked her. Nobody had submitted architectural drawings to her review committee. Nobody had sat in front of her board and waited for her to decide. She sent a notice 2 weeks after installation. I filed it. I didn't respond. In 11 years of running Crestview Lane, nobody had ever simply not responded to Karen Whitfield. I didn't know that at the time. I found out later that my silence had been to her a provocation so clean and direct it had kept her up at night. 2 weeks after the notice, I heard a knock at my front door. I opened it to find Karen standing on my porch. She had 2 board members flanking her slightly behind the formation of someone who brings witnesses because she's learned that witnesses change behavior. In her hand was a printed fine notice, already stamped, already dated. She hadn't come to talk. I opened the door and Karen was already talking. Not to me. To the board member on her left, something about the upcoming landscape audit finishing a sentence that had nothing to do with why she was standing on my porch. She made me wait for the end of it. That was intentional. Small dominance practiced over years. She finished the sentence, turned to face me, and shifted her expression into something that was not quite a smile. "Mr. Crawford," she said my name like a file reference, "we need to discuss your rear lot." She held out the fine notice before I'd said a word. I took it. $200 per day, printed in a clean sans serif font, already stamped, already dated. The citation line, unauthorized permanent external structure HOA addendum 7 section 4, fine accrues daily until structure is removed or architectural review board approval is obtained. $200 per day. She had two board members with her, Dave Kowalski, who'd been on the board for 6 years and had the look of a man who had long since stopped forming his own opinions, and a newer member I recognized from the neighborhood newsletter, but hadn't spoken to. They stood slightly behind her and slightly to either side. Witnesses. She brought witnesses when she expected resistance. I looked at the notice, then I looked at Karen. "Can I get a copy of the specific bylaw you're citing?" I said the board approval procedure with the timeline and the meeting minutes from the session where this fine was authorized. She blinked. It was brief, barely visible, but it was there. She had expected anger or argument or the particular collapse that happened when people saw a number like $200 per day and did the math out loud. She hadn't expected a list of procedural requests delivered in the same tone you'd use to order something at a counter. She reached into the binder she was carrying and produced a photocopied page. Section 4 is clearly outlined here. She extended it toward me. I took it with my other hand. Photographed both documents, the fine notice and the photocopy, right there on my doorstep with her watching. Date stamped. Filed. "The meeting minutes," I said again. "Board administrative records aren't distributed on demand." Her voice had moved down a register. "You can request them through the formal channel, which takes 30 days. I nodded. "I'll do that." Then she went further. Karen Whitfield, in 11 years, had learned that when someone doesn't fold on the first number, you move to a larger number. She straightened slightly, not much, just enough, and looked at me with the measured patience of someone about to explain something to a person they've already decided is being deliberately difficult. "I want to make sure you understand what you're looking at, Mr. Crawford. $200 a day compounds quickly. By the end of this month, you'd be looking at $6,000 in outstanding fines. At 60 days, $10,000. This HOA has the legal authority to place a lien on your property for unpaid assessments. We have exercised that authority before in this community." She paused to let the word lien finish its work. "We have had homeowners lose their homes over exactly this kind of non-compliance." She said it without inflection. "The way you state a fact you've stated many times and have watched land exactly the way you intended it to land. Not a threat, a weather report. This is what happens." She had told this to Margaret. She had told this to Eduardo. She had watched both of them go quiet and reach for their checkbooks. I said nothing for a moment. In the silence, Karen's expression settled into something close to satisfaction. She had watched this silence before. She knew what it usually meant. What it meant this time was different. What it meant was that I was looking at the photocopy she'd handed me and noticing something. Not all of it, not yet. Just a word and then a phrase and then a small friction between what I was reading and what I thought I remembered from the CC&RS I'd read before closing. Small enough that I wasn't certain. Certain enough that I needed to check. "Thank you for coming by," I said. Karen's chin lifted a fraction. She hadn't been dismissed before. Not by a homeowner. Not on a porch. I told them I'd be in touch. I closed the door. I went to my filing cabinet and pulled out my copy of the registered CC&Rs, the ones I'd received at closing, sourced directly from the title company, dated and stamped. I put them on the desk next to Karen's photocopy. I read through section 4 of Karen's version. Then I looked for the same section in mine. Then I sat back. Then I picked up my phone and called the county assessor's office. They were open until 4:30. I was on hold for 11 minutes. When someone picked up, I asked what I needed to ask, got the answer I needed, and requested that a copy be mailed to my address along with the full registered plat documentation for Lot 14. The person on the other end said it would arrive in 5 to 7 business days. I thanked them, hung up, and went back to the kitchen. I added 3 new items to my folder. The fine notice, Karen's bylaw photocopy, and my own photograph of all of it, time-stamped with a label I typed and printed that same afternoon. Karen Whitfield front door confrontation documents received. She had said the fine could hit $10,000 by the end of the month. She meant every word of it. What she didn't know was that I had already called the county assessor's office that morning, and what I'd found there made the $10,000 look like a parking ticket. Word travels in a quiet neighborhood faster than you'd expect. I hadn't told anyone I'd called the county assessor's office. I hadn't mentioned it to the Garcias when I passed Eduardo at the end of his driveway that week. I hadn't said anything to the couple 2 streets over who'd repainted their door twice in 14 months. I'd made a phone call, requested some documents, and gone back to my life. But Karen's visit had been seen. Her formation, the 2 board members, the clipboard, the stamped notice had been noted from windows and driveways, and apparently the fact that I had not, in the days that followed, removed my jacuzzi, repainted anything, or written a check, had also been noted. Margaret Elkins knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening 9 days after Karen's porch visit. She was holding a manila folder against her chest with both hands, the way you hold something you've been carrying for a long time and are uncertain whether to put down. I brought her inside, made coffee. She sat at my kitchen table and she set the folder down and didn't open it right away. "I heard you went to the county office," she said. "I did." She looked at the folder. "I didn't know you could do that." She'd been in the neighborhood for 19 years. Her husband, Frank, had grown up 3 blocks from where they eventually bought their house. He'd died in February, a Tuesday, she said, which I noted she remembered specifically. 8 weeks later, she'd hung the flag. She described buying it a garden center on Route 9, the kind of place that smells like fertilizer and wood chips. She'd paid $18 for it. The fine notice arrived 6 days after she'd put it up. I asked her, "Did you ever ask to see the board meeting minutes from the session where they voted to authorize that fine?" She hadn't. She told me she'd assumed there was a proper process behind it. She'd assumed the notice was legitimate because it looked legitimate, the HOA letterhead, the stamped date, the formal citation language. She had paid $400 for a flag that cost $18 because the notice looked like something a person was supposed to comply with. I asked her to tell me exactly what she'd been cited under. She opened the folder. The citation on her notice read, "Exterior flag display in non-standard color pattern section 9 Visual Standards Community Aesthetic Guidelines." I wrote it down. Then she pulled out of the photocopy of section 9 that Karen had provided when Margaret asked for the relevant bylaw. It described in 2 paragraphs the HOA's authority over exterior color standards for painted surfaces and permanent structures. It said nothing about flags. Not one word about flags. Eduardo Garcia came by the following Thursday. He brought Rosa. They sat at the same kitchen table, and Eduardo put his own folder down next to Margaret's. And I thought about the fact that Karen Whitfield had, without knowing it, created a filing habit in at least 3 households in this neighborhood. The Garcias' lien threat cited a vehicle policy violation. The specific clause repeated overnight street parking by resident vehicles, section 14 traffic and parking standards. Marco's cousins had been there on a Saturday afternoon. They had left before 10 p.m. Not one vehicle had been present overnight. I asked Eduardo the same question I'd asked Margaret. "Did you ask to see the dispute procedure, the 30-day window?" He had. He'd called the HOA number listed on the notice. Karen had answered. She answered every call to that number and told him the 30-day dispute window had been waived by the board due to the repeated nature of the violation. One incident, one afternoon, one birthday party. Waived. Did she send anything in writing confirming that? I asked. Eduardo looked at me. "No," Rosa said quietly. "We didn't know we could push back on that." I understood. That was the whole point. Karen's system worked because nobody knew what they could push back on, and Karen never volunteered the information. The county documents arrived on a Friday. Padded envelope, county seal on the return address, 2 items inside the property tax record for Lot 14, and the full registered HOA bylaws for Crestview Lane subdivision. The original filing stamped and certified by the county recorder's office in the year the subdivision was registered. I sat down with Karen's photocopy of Addendum 7 Section 4, the one she'd handed me on my porch, and the county registered version of the same section. I went through them line by line. The county registered text read, "Permanent structural additions to the building exterior require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Board." Karen's distributed version read, "Permanent external structures require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Board." 2 words were different. Structural additions to the building exterior had become external structures. Those 2 words were the entire legal difference between a clause that applied to my jacuzzi and a clause that didn't. A ground-level concrete pad behind a house is not a structural addition to a building's exterior. It sits on the ground. It is not attached to the building. It does not alter the building's exterior in any way. Under the county-registered language, it falls entirely outside the scope of Section 4. Under Karen's version, it didn't. I set the 2 pages side by side and looked at them for a long moment. Then I pulled out a fresh label, typed the date and description, and added both documents to the folder. County Registered Bylaws versus Karen Whitfield Distributed Version Language Discrepancy Addendum 7 Section 4. I also filed the property tax record. My name, Lot 14, 14 Crestview Lane, sole owner. No outstanding liens, no encumbrances, no HOA claims of any kind yet on record. Not the deed, but close. The deed was in the same cabinet 2 folders over. I hadn't needed it yet. I was beginning to understand what I was holding. Not just the bylaw discrepancy, though, that alone was enough to void every fine Karen had issued me. Not just the tax record, not just Margaret's story or Eduardo's. I was holding a pattern, 11 years of it. Fines issued without board votes, threats issued without procedural basis, language distributed to homeowners that did not match the language filed with the county. Karen hadn't just been difficult. She had been operating outside the authority her own documents gave her, and she had done it for so long to so many people that it had simply become the way things were. Then Karen called an emergency HOA meeting with 1 day's notice. The single agenda item, a proposal to reclassify the rear boundary lines of 3 properties on Crestview Lane as HOA common area. Mine was one of the 3. The notice appeared under my front door on a Wednesday evening. I found it when I got home just after 6, a single sheet, HOA letterhead, dated the previous night. Emergency HOA, Architectural and Property Review Meeting. Thursday, 7 p.m. Community Room B. 1 day's notice. 1 agenda item listed at the bottom in the same clean sans serif font Karen used for everything. Lot Boundary Clarification Amendment, Rear Parcels, Crestview Lane. I stood in my entryway and read it twice. Then I pulled out the county-registered bylaws, the ones I'd received from the assessor's office stamped and certified, and found the section on special and emergency sessions. The language was not ambiguous. Emergency sessions require a minimum of 72 hours written notice to all homeowners of record. 72 hours, she'd given me 18. I photographed the notice with my phone timestamp visible, filed it. Then I looked at my calendar and confirmed I was free Thursday at 7. I had been to the county surveyor's office 3 days before the notice arrived. Not because I'd anticipated this. I'd gone because when the assessor's office sent me the tax record and the registered bylaws, the cover letter had referenced a plat document, the original 1987 subdivision survey, and I'd wanted to see it. I was methodical about these things. I liked having the complete picture. The county surveyor's office was a low brick building 12 minutes from my house. A woman at the counter pulled the plat for Crestview Lane subdivision without any particular ceremony. She made a certified copy, charged me $11, and handed it over in a manila sleeve. I'd unrolled it on my kitchen table that evening and spent about 20 minutes with it. The lot lines for Parcel 14 were drawn in the particular precise ink of a 1987 survey, clean black, unambiguous. My rear boundary line ran exactly where I'd assumed it ran. No buffer zone, no common area designation. No easement of any kind over the rear 15 feet of my lot or anyone else's on my block. Whatever Karen was going to claim at Thursday's meeting, it was not on this map. I rolled the plat back up, slid it into the manila sleeve, and added it to the folder. The community room was a beige rectangle attached to the back of the HOA management building, the kind of room that had been hosting these meetings for decades and showed it. Folding chairs, a whiteboard, a long table at the front where Karen and 2 board members sat with their binders. 7 homeowners in the room when I arrived, including me. I took a seat near the front, set nothing on the table, and waited. My phone was in my breast pocket, recording. Karen opened at 7 on the dot. She moved through 2 routine items, a landscaping contractor renewal, a parking lot resurfacing timeline with practiced efficiency. Then, she set those papers aside and produced a printed map, color-coded, professional-looking, the kind of document that if you didn't know better, looked authoritative. The board has been reviewing our founding documents, she said, and we've identified an inconsistency that requires clarification. The rear 15 feet of select parcels along Crestview Lane were originally designated as HOA buffer zone common area in the subdivision's founding charter. This amendment formalizes that designation. She held up the map, 3 parcels highlighted in yellow. Mine was the middle one. Nobody in the room asked where the founding charter was. Nobody asked to see it. 6 homeowners sat in folding chairs and watched Karen hold up a color-coded map, and the room had the particular silence of people who had learned that questions made things worse. I raised my hand. Karen looked at me with the expression of someone who had budgeted no time for this. Yes, I stood up. I'd like to see the recorded document reference for the buffer zone designation before this goes to a vote, specifically the book and page number from the county recorder's office where the founding charter is filed. A pause, brief. These are internal founding documents, Karen said. They're not something the board presents on demand at a meeting. Then they can't be used to amend property boundaries. I kept my voice level. Recorded plats govern lot lines under state property law. Internal documents don't override them. I have the 1987 plat for this subdivision. The rear boundary of Lot 14 is unambiguous. No buffer zone appears anywhere on the recorded survey. The room moved. Not dramatically, just a shift. A homeowner in the second row leaned forward slightly. Another looked at Karen, then back at me. Karen said, "The board has reviewed this thoroughly, and we're confident in our legal position." She called the vote. 3 board members, 3 ayes, motion carried. Before I reached the door, she handed me a formal written notice already printed, which meant she'd brought it with her, which meant the vote had never been in question. Rear lot boundary reclassification pending county recordation. Use of non-compliant structures on the affected parcel is hereby suspended by board order. I took the notice. I read it once. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. I drove home in silence. Not the silence of someone who didn't know what to do. The silence of someone running through a very specific sequence in their head, confirming the order of each step, making sure nothing was skipped. Karen had just tried to take 15 feet off the back of my lot using a document that didn't exist in any county file in a meeting she'd called with 18 hours notice instead of the 72 her own bylaws required with a vote she'd brought pre-printed results for before any discussion had taken place. She had done all of this to a man whose deed was sitting in a filing cabinet 30 feet from where I was now parking my car. I went inside. I called my real estate attorney not to file a lawsuit, not to threaten anything, just to file a preemptive objection with the county recorder before Karen's reclassification reached the queue. I needed the plat on record against her filing first. He said he could have it done by end of week. I thanked him. Hung up and added 4 items to the folder. The emergency meeting notice, the formal written order Karen had handed me at the door, a time-stamped export of the audio recording from my phone, and a printout of the relevant bylaw, the one requiring 72 hours notice with the 18-hour gap marked in the margin. Karen had just tried to reclassify the ground under my feet as HOA property in a meeting she'd called illegally with a vote she had no authority to hold. What she didn't know was that I had been sitting on the one document that made every single word she'd said in that room legally meaningless, and I was done waiting to use it. The newsletter arrived on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after the emergency meeting. It was printed on cream-colored paper, HOA letterhead. The little crest with the oak tree in the corner folded twice and slipped through mail slots at all 96 homes in the subdivision. I found mine when I came downstairs at 7. I stood in my kitchen and read it while the coffee brewed. The front section headline read, "Board moves to protect community standards, rear lot buffer zone formalized." The third paragraph, "The board wishes to inform residents that the jacuzzi structure at 14 Crestview Lane is now in violation of board-mandated property use restrictions. Use of the structure has been suspended pending compliance resolution. The board thanks residents for their patience as we continue to uphold the standards that make Crestview Lane the community we all value." She had written it as settled fact, not a proposal, not a pending action. Settled fact. Distributed to 96 households. My name and my address in print as a compliance problem. I folded the newsletter, labeled it with the date, and added it to the folder. Margaret called me that afternoon. She said, "She's telling everyone it's over." "Is it?" Her voice was careful, the kind of careful that comes from having been wrong about something like this before. "No," I said, "it's not." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Okay." That was the whole conversation. I don't think Margaret needed more than that word "okay" delivered in a tone that wasn't performance or bravado, just certainty. She told me later it was the first time in 11 years she'd heard that tone from a neighbor talking about Karen, and that it had kept her calmer than she'd expected to be for the 2 weeks that followed. Eduardo called that evening. I gave him the same answer. He passed it to Rosa. The county recorder's letter arrived 4 days after the newsletter. It came to my attorney's office. He forwarded it to me by end of day with no commentary beyond, "As expected, call me if you want to discuss next steps." The letter was 2 paragraphs. County letterhead. The relevant sentence, the described buffer zone designation, does not correspond to any recorded plat easement deed restriction covenant or founding document on file with this office for Crestview Lane subdivision. The reclassification filing has been rejected and will not be recorded. Karen's filing was dead. The county had reviewed her founding charter reference and found no such document existed in any county record. The rear boundary of Lot 14 remained exactly where the 1987 plat said it was exactly where it had always been. She had distributed that newsletter, my name, my jacuzzi, my address, printed in 96 mailboxes as a resolved compliance violation after this letter was already sitting in my attorney's inbox. She just didn't know it yet. I added the county rejection letter to the folder behind the plat map and in front of the bylaw comparison. The folder was getting thick. I pressed it flat with my palm and clipped it shut. 3 homeowners, none of them, Margaret, none of them, Eduardo. 3 people I had never spoken to independently contacted the HOA board in the week that followed, asking about the county status of the boundary reclassification. I don't know exactly what prompted them, possibly the newsletter, possibly the fact that for the first time in recent memory, someone at 14 Crestview Lane had not removed the thing Karen told them to remove. Karen's response was to schedule the annual community standards meeting. It was the largest HOA gathering of the year. Expected attendance 60-plus homeowners, full agenda. The kind of meeting Karen ran like a conductor runs an orchestra, every item timed, every topic controlled, every question managed before it became uncomfortable. She sent the notice with proper lead time this time. 72 hours printed, distributed. The agenda listed 7 items. The last one read, Property Compliance Updates Board Report. I RSVP'd for the first time in 3 years of owning my home. I arrived 11 minutes early. The community room was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Rows of folding chairs. Most of them occupied a low hum of conversation that went slightly quieter when people noticed me come in. I recognized faces. Some I knew by name. Most I knew by their stories. The flag find, the birthday party, lean the door repainted twice. They were all there. 62 homeowners in a beige room under fluorescent lights waiting for Karen to tell them how things were. I took a seat near the front. I set my manila folder on the table in front of me. I did not open it. I folded my hands on top of it and waited. Karen was already at the head table with the 2 board members. She saw me come in. Her eyes moved to the folder, then back to the room, and she began the meeting exactly on time with the particular energy of someone who has decided a thing is already finished. She ran the first 6 agenda items in 40 minutes. Landscaping contract, parking lot resurfacing, pool hours for the coming season, guest policy revision, 2 minor bylaw clarifications. She was efficient and precise and utterly at ease the way a person is at ease when they believe they are standing on solid ground. When she reached the 7th item, she set her papers down slightly and let a small pause land before she spoke. I'm pleased to report that the board has successfully resolved the compliance matter on Crestview Lane. The rear lot boundary clarification is complete. The community can expect further updates on adjacent parcels in the coming months as we continue to formalize these long-standing designations. She was already talking about the next property. She had come to the largest meeting of the year to announce one victory and begin the groundwork for the next one. She was already expanding. The folder in front of me had not moved. She told 62 homeowners the matter was settled and moved on without breaking her rhythm. She hadn't asked whether anyone had questions. She hadn't looked at the folder again. She had been running this meeting for 11 minutes. I had been waiting for 11 minutes to raise my hand. Karen moved to close the meeting at the end of agenda item 7. My hand went up. Yes. She said it the way she'd said it at the emergency meeting, the measured tone of someone granting a minor concession before pressing on. I stood up. I opened the folder. The deed was on top. I'd placed it there before I left the house. 1 page. County seal bottom right corner. I held it up so the room could see it, then set it flat on the table and read, This deed recorded at the county recorder's office describes the property at 14 Crestview Lane designated as Lot 14 Crestview Lane subdivision, including all structures and improvements to the rear lot line as surveyed in Plat Book 12, page 47. I looked up at Karen. The owner of record is my legal name, solely. No HOA encumbrances, no easements, no buffer zone designation of any kind. I set the deed flat on the table. The jacuzzi is on my property. It has always been on my property. The lot line your amendment attempted to reclassify last month is described on this document. The county confirmed in writing that your filing was rejected. The ground you claimed belonged to the HOA has belonged to me since the day I closed on this house. The room was completely still. Not the trained silence of people who had learned that staying quiet made things easier. Something different. 62 people in folding chairs, and not one of them was looking at Karen Whitfield. They were all looking at the deed on the table. Karen moved first. She opened her binder fast, slightly mechanical, the reflex of someone reaching for the instrument that had always worked, and said, "That doesn't override HOA authority over community standards. The architectural review requirement. Let me show the room something." I produced 2 pages, side by side, labeled at the top in my own handwriting, county registered on the left, distributed by Karen Whitfield on the right. I held them up so the room could see both. The version she hands to homeowners states, "Permanent external structures require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Board." The language filed with the county reads, "Permanent structural additions to the building exterior." A ground-level jacuzzi pad is not a structural addition to a building's exterior. The fine basis she has been citing does not exist in any legally registered document. I placed both pages next to the deed. The sound the room made was low and collective, not quite words, not quite silence. The homeowner in the second row leaned sideways and said something to the woman beside him. She looked at Karen. She looked back at the table. 2 rows behind her, a man I didn't know was reading the bylaw pages from where he sat leaning forward in his chair. Dave Kowalski, the longer-serving board member, was not looking at Karen. He was looking at the 2 bylaw pages. His pen was down. Karen said, "Our legal counsel has reviewed. The county reviewed it too." I produced the rejection letter. I read one sentence slowly. "The described buffer zone designation does not correspond to any recorded plat, easement, deed restriction covenant, or founding document on file with this office for Crestview Lane subdivision. The reclassification filing has been rejected and will not be recorded." I set the letter down. This letter existed before the newsletter went out. You told 96 households the boundary reclassification was finalized. The county had already rejected the filing. Silence. A different kind than before. The kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously revises something they thought they understood. I watched 4 or 5 people look at each other, the particular look of people confirming that the other person is also hearing what they're hearing. Karen's chin was still up, but the board member to her right, the newer one who I had never spoken to, had pushed his chair back from the table, an inch, maybe less, just enough to be noticed. "The vote that authorized the reclassification," I said, "was held at a meeting called with 18 hours notice. The registered bylaws require 72. The vote was procedurally void before the gavel came down." I set the emergency meeting notice on the table, the one she'd slipped under my door, timestamp visible. I also have the full audio recording from that meeting. I did not play it. I didn't need to. Dave Kowalski closed his binder. It was a quiet thing, a small thing. But in the room it landed the way quiet things land when everyone notices them at the same time. He placed both hands flat on the closed cover and looked at the table. Karen looked at him. He didn't look back. She looked out at the room, and for the first time in 11 years, I think she found it looking back at her differently. Margaret Elkins stood up. She did it slowly. She was 72, and her knees had been troubling her since winter, and she steadied herself with one hand on the back of the chair in front of her. When she was fully upright, her voice shook once at the very first word, and then it held. "She fined me $400 for a flag I hung 2 months after my husband died. I asked to see the board meeting minutes where they voted to authorize that fine." She paused. "She told me they were under administrative review. There were no minutes. There was no vote." Another pause. Shorter. "I want my $400 back." Nobody laughed. Nobody shifted uncomfortably or looked away. Eduardo Garcia stood up 2 rows behind her. Then a woman near the middle of the room I'd never spoken to. Then a man by the door I would learn later he'd been fined 3 times for a boat trailer he stored inside his own garage. 4 people on their feet in a room that had been sitting down for 11 years. Karen's mouth opened. It closed. I picked the deed up from the table. I held it in both hands and looked at Karen Whitfield directly. "You told the officers the night you called 911 on me, and there is a recording of that conversation as well, that nobody who genuinely owns in this community sits in that jacuzzi without checking in with the board first." I set the deed back down, flat on the table. The deed says what the deed says. I sat down. Dave Kowalski spoke without looking up. His voice was quiet and final. "I think we need to pause this meeting and consult with an attorney before we go any further. In 11 years of HOA meetings, no board member had ever moved against Karen's direction in a public session." Karen sat down. The binder stayed closed on the table in front of her. I drove home from the annual meeting in the same silence I'd driven home from the emergency meeting 3 weeks earlier. Different silence, though. That one had been the silence of calculation, running steps, confirming sequence, knowing what needed to happen next. This one was something else, looser. The kind of quiet that settles in when you've done the thing you needed to do and your body is catching up to the fact that it's over. I made tea. I sat in the kitchen. An hour after I'd walked in the door, my phone rang. It was Dave Kowalski, not Karen. She had left the community room before the meeting formally adjourned, slipped out while people were still standing, still talking, still recalibrating what 11 years of this neighborhood actually looked like. Dave had stayed. He'd helped stack chairs, apparently. I don't know why. Maybe he needed something to do with his hands. He said, "We'll be convening a review session next week. The fines, the bylaw procedures, the president's authority, all of it." A pause. I want you to know this wasn't something I understood the full extent of. I didn't challenge that. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. It wasn't the thing that mattered now. "Okay," I said. "I appreciate the call." It was the first time the board had initiated a session that Karen hadn't called. My attorney filed the formal title confirmation with the county within the week. All HOA contested actions against Lot. 14 the fines, the architectural review order, the boundary reclassification notice were formally withdrawn from record. Clean. Unencumbered. Exactly as the deed had always described it. The formal complaint to the state HOA regulatory body went out 10 days after the meeting. Co-signed by me, Margaret Eduardo, and Rosa Garcia, and 4 other homeowners who had come to me in the days following quietly the way people approach something they've wanted to do for a long time, but weren't sure they were allowed to. The complaint documented 5 things: the falsified bylaw language, the fines issued without board votes on record, the procedurally void emergency meeting vote, the false public statements in the newsletter, and a summary of the pattern across multiple households over multiple years. The regulatory body opened a formal review within 30 days. I don't have a dramatic scene to give you from that process. It was paperwork and waiting. The folder I'd been building for 3 years turned out to be exactly what a formal regulatory review needed, and I handed it over and let the process do what processes are supposed to do when the evidence is clean and the documentation is complete. The HOA board issued a written retraction of all fines against me 2 weeks after the meeting. The letter was formal and brief and contained no apology, which I hadn't expected and didn't need. Margaret's check arrived 12 days after the retraction, $400. She called me when it came. She didn't say much. Neither did I. She said she was going to buy another flag, same style, same pole, and I said that sounded right, and that was mostly the whole conversation. 3 other homeowners filed refund requests that same week, then 4 more. The board, operating now under legal counsel they hadn't previously retained, opened a forensic review of HOA fine collections for the previous 7 years. The review found that not all collected fine revenue was traceable back to the HOA operating fund. Karen was asked to provide documentation accounting for the discrepancy. She did not respond promptly. Her resignation letter to the board was 2 sentences. I never saw it. Dave mentioned its length to me in passing, the way you mention a detail that strikes you as somehow both insufficient and exactly right. No community announcement, no explanation, no goodbye. The board sent a standard notification email to all 96 households. Karen Whitfield has stepped down as HOA board president effective immediately. The board will hold elections for a new president within 60 days. The neighborhood email chain, the one that had been used for years primarily to receive Karen's notices and fine updates, and never to reply, generated 34 responses in under 2 hours. Most were from people who had been fined. One message from an address 3 streets over that I didn't recognize said only, "Finally." Margaret hung the flag the following week. Same pole, same bracket, same spot on the front porch where it had been the first time. A Saturday morning. I happened to be driving past on my way back from the hardware store, and I saw it from the road, the colors catching the light, and I didn't stop. She didn't need me to stop. It wasn't a moment that required a witness. It just was. The Garcias' son parked on the street for his graduation party that June. Cars lining both sides for 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon. Eduardo told me later that he'd stood at his front window for the first 20 minutes waiting for a knock on the door that didn't come. It didn't come. The couple 2 blocks down repainted their front door, dark green. The color they'd picked out 3 years ago before Karen's first revision notice had arrived. I learned this from Rosa, who had learned it from a conversation at the mailboxes, and the fact that conversations were happening at the mailboxes again was its own kind of information about what the neighborhood had become. Small things. But the air was different. You could feel it the way you feel a pressure change, not in any one moment, just gradually over days until you realized the tightness you'd been carrying so long, you'd stopped noticing it was no longer there. On the Sunday 4 weeks after the meeting, I lowered myself into the jacuzzi at 4 in the afternoon. Same temperature. Same light coming over the fence at the same angle it always did in late afternoon. A glass of iced tea on the ledge, same as before. The iron numbers on the gate, 14 Crestview Lane. Same latch, same post, same fence line running the full rear boundary of Lot 14, exactly as the 1987 plat described it. I'd added a small sign to the gate 2 weeks after the meeting. White background, black letters, nothing fancy, private property, no entry. Not because I needed it, not because I was making a point to anyone, just because I could and because it was true and because the deed said so. I sat in the water, no sirens from the street, no voice on the other side of the fence talking into a phone, no shadow at the gate line, no knock, no badge numbers, no laminated card, no stamped fine notice, no threat of liens or foreclosure or the slow procedural erosion of something that had always in every document that mattered been mine. Just the water, the late afternoon light, the gate with my number on it. The deed says what the deed says. It always did.